Thanks, Michael. I'll now talk about the next stage of what needs to be done. The whole idea that the corporation is important is something we're all familiar with. We are from that world. But how important is something that I really understood only after I'd gone through the whole process of creating the Green Economy Report and working on TEEB, leaving me to feel that this wonderful toolkit of TEEB would just remain unused, just adorning bookshelves. And the great proofs that we had created as required in the Green Economy project, the Green Economy Report, which was published in February last year, would just go nowhere because basically the corporation isn't moving in that direction. So this campaign called Corporation 2020 and the book that is called Corporation 2020 is basically about what changes you need at the corporation level in order that you can create a green economy. And the reason for 2020, and I owe the 2020 an explanation because there is another 20/20. There's a Corporation 20/20, as in the right vision for a corporation. That's Alan White's campaign for changing the nature of the corporation. I agree with him. But I've given 2020 a different meaning. It is the year 2020, by which time we have to make changes, because if we don't, we will hit exactly the planetary boundaries that Will Stephan talked about this morning. And this conversation that I begin now is really about that. Firstly, why is cooperation important? Economic direction and resource use is determined by the components of the economy. The largest components of the economy are corporations. In the US, it's 75% of GDP, 83% of jobs. That's the private sector. Globally, the answer is 60% and 70%. You don't have a snowball's hope in hell of achieving change in the economy if you don't achieve change at the corporation level. You know, the sum of the parts will add up to the whole. If your corporations are brown, then what you will have is a brown economy. You can keep pointing from the pedestal and saying, move that direction, and in fact, you're moving in this direction. That's actually what's happening today. So we need to look at what changes are needed in the corporation, and those are fairly deep and trenchant changes. And the reason is this, because the defining behavior of today's corporation are actually such that it is hardwired to create its best performance in a brown economy. And here's why. These are the four defining behaviors of what I call Corporation 1920. One is the pursuit of size, and how important is this? Let's look at some statistics. In 1920, the number of corporations whose turnover was greater than $25 billion was just 20. In 1970, it was just 20 corporations whose turnover exceeds $25 billion. In 2010, 40 years later, that number had gone up to 350. That's a huge, huge change over a 40-year period. What is interesting is that if we look, and of course, part of that is because the world's economy has grown and corporate turnovers and profits are a key part of the economy. But if you look at the number of corporations in 1970 whose turnover was greater than 0.1% of GDP, that answer is 21. But if you look at 2010, even that has increased from 21 to 122. That's saying something. And what that's saying is that this bulking up of the corporation is not merely an incidental, it is actually central to the success model of today's corporation. Today's corporation is a multinational. It is an arbitrager in many dimensions. It arbitrages resources from where they are ill-governed, or from Australia, where they're cheap. It arbitrages labor from where it's cheapest, which is China, India, Vietnam, Cambodia, etc., etc. It arbitrages manufacturing capacity from where it is best subsidized, which could be South Korea or Singapore or Malaysia or India or a few other places like that. And finally, it arbitrages demand for goods and services, which it markets, from the richest markets, which basically means USA, Japan, Europe, and the top quartile of the BRIC nations, which are now getting richer. So it's this multidimensional global arbitrager, and it is possible to be that because of two things that have significantly changed and improved over the last 40 years. One is trade, and the other is capital markets. The corporation today is trading a hell of a lot because of simple technological changes like the barcode. The fact that products are barcoded means that you can reconfigure entire supply chains. You know exactly what is where, the raw material all the way down to the finished good. And you can reconfigure that because you can control based on the electronic information from one place. Even containerization is relatively a new phenomenon. So trade has actually technologically improved over these last 60 odd years. Before 1942, 43, there were problems in the US in terms of allowing containerization. There were regulations against standardization, effectively pushbacks on that. That changed. So what this means is basically trade is now not just 3% of global GDP, which it used to be in 1970. Trade as a fraction of GDP, you'll be astonished, is now 30% of GDP. That gives you a sense of the scale, of the footprint of today's MNC, and which means basically everything is being moved from one point to the next, to the next, to the next. As you resource from here, assemble there, manufacture there, market there, sell here. This is what is happening. So we are increasing the footprint of the corporation in the process of becoming this large, successful, multidimensional arbitrager. And that's today's corporation. I call this effect the biggest beautiful effect, with apologies to Schumacher. It's biggest beautiful is the belief here, and that's the direction we're going. Another aspect of today's corporation is lobbying, and of course, we know that. Corporations are, as senior managements, probably the best investment of their time is actually lobbying in order to tilt the football field in their direction, and if it's already tilted, to keep it tilted so that you can keep the advantages that you have, competitive advantages in your pockets. Stories are aplenty, but some of the lobbying that has been damaging to society is quite remarkable. I can only cite one example of lead in fuel, which was a lead derivative was basically introduced into fuel as an anti-knocking agent very early on in the early 20s. And even at that time, alternatives were available. In fact, ethanol was an alternative anti-knocking agent, which wasn't used because you couldn't patent ethanol. That means you couldn't charge money for every liter of fuel that you sold or gallon of fuel that you sold. And General Motors and Standard Oil basically did this strategy of ensuring that this anti-knocking lead agent was there in fuel so that they could improve their profits. And then they lobbied hard, despite medical evidence to the contrary, that there was damage to human health in lead, despite deaths in their factories. They lobbied hard to prevent that from changing. And this lobbying was so successful, it was unchanged for the next 60 years. It was only in the early 80s that finally lead was pulled out of petrol. And here's the ethical issue, is how do we just accept that? But if you think that's bad, look at advertising. From 1936, the US Surgeon General declares in a formal note that there is a cancer risk, and you have to wait until 1970 for cigarette advertising to go off the air. And even after that, when they tried to introduce it into the UK, the cleverness of advertising comes into play. Silk Cut, does anyone remember Silk Cut? A cigarette which basically was advertised deliberately. They changed the campaign before cigarette smoking ads were banned in the UK to introduce this idea of a scissor cutting through purple silk. So, and then of course the guy smoking. And literally the day after the ban was introduced, the scissor kept cutting through the purple silk, but there was no smoker or no cigarette in the ad. And then the advertising agency, to prove how clever it was, did a survey on whether people recognized that as being a silk cut ad. And sure enough, 98% surveyed said, yes, this is a cigarette ad. This is, of course, you followed the letter of the law because there's no cigarette being advertised, but not the spirit. So this is considered clever. I actually think this is stupid. You're trying to damage human health. Finally, the government has woken up after 40 long years doing the right thing, which it should have done 40 years ago, and you're preventing it from doing the right thing. That is not clever. That is stupid in my lexicon. Anyway, then we have this whole issue of leverage. I mean, leverage has been the driver of the last 4 recessions. It's not just this mortgage crisis, but the previous crisis in Asian debt, companies leveraging in the wrong currency, basically, borrowing in dollars when they should be borrowing in Indonesian rupiah or ringgits. And before that, the US savings and loans crisis, again, a leverage issue, basically misused expansion of balance sheets. And before that, the Latin American debt crisis. Leverage, 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 leverage. The last 4 major crises have been driven by or aided and abetted by an abuse of leverage or a misuse of leverage or excessive leverage, and we still don't get it. We still think the problem is with the banks, that you've got to control bank capital. But excuse me, the last 2 crises took place during the time when BIS and Basel and EC regulations existed on bank capital. That's not the problem. It's not the intermediary that matters. It's the agent who is taking the money. It's the borrower where leverage has to be controlled. If you do not control, and this is my big worry, is I think the next crisis will come out of, again, uncontrolled leverage, because we still haven't got the joke. We are still pretending that we've solved the problem when we haven't. And you will just get companies which are too big to fail, effectively being in a situation where they have an asymmetric profile. The profits are theirs, the risk and the cost is somebody else's. The government will bail them out because they can't afford to lose the jobs or the volatility that ensues. And the net result is taxpayers pay. Of course, this is very personal because, I pay taxes in 4 countries, so I get really upset about I get really upset about this one. Yes. And when will this change? I don't know. And we just have to attack the real issue here, which is the overuse of leverage, and we have to attack it, and I'll explain how. Now, one key result of all of these behaviors of what I call Corporation 1920 is negative externalities. And I'll have to, Josh, have you covered the mangrove shrimp slide, or has anyone? Okay, then I'm sorry, I have this. This is a very favorite slide of all the team family. So apologies for those of you who've seen this before, but externalities need to be explained. Externalities are the third-party costs of doing business as usual. Like, I make cars, I make a profit, I sell it to you, you buy the car, you get mobility, you're happy, I'm happy. But she's not happy because, the fumes of the car are causing you lung cancer, or he's not happy because, his property close to the beach has got submerged because of excessive climate changing cyclones and storms, or whatever. So these people have suffered the externalities of your deal with me. It's a bilateral deal. We are both happy. They're not. Externality, third-party impacts. But why is this a problem? Well, here's a small example of why it's a problem. Because in South Thailand, for a long while, decades in fact, the conversion of mangrove swamps into shrimp farms is going on the ostensible logic that this is commercially successful. It makes sense because the trade-off is if you leave it as a mangrove, you just get about $600 worth of value. This is over a 9-year period for which these studies typically was applied, as against $9,600 if you convert it to a shrimp farm. So that's the profit on a shrimp farm. This is the gain, if you like, to the local community of collecting fuel wood. What's the problem? Just keep converting, you'll do fine. But hang on. You have to look at the subsidies given to the shrimp farm. That's almost $8,000 per hectare. So if you subtract the subsidies, the equation, the comparison isn't that hot. It's between 1,200 and 600. But further, if you think for a moment and say, what about the externalities? What about the good things that the mangrove does for free, which is storm protection and providing fish nurseries? And what about the bad things that the shrimp farming does at the cost of society, which is that after 5-7 years, because of salt deposition and chemical deposition, the land becomes impossible to use, even for shrimp farming. So you need to restore the land, and that costs about $10,000 a hectare. Now look at the comparison. So you've got the benefits of the mangroves when you suddenly started calculating them. Professor Barbier and his team had done this, and you've got the cost of restoring this when you completely ruin the land after 6-8 years of shrimp farming. What does this look like? So clearly, the lens matters, right? So if you use the lens of private profits, you'll come to one conclusion. The trade-off choice is get rid of mangrove, introduce shrimp farming. If you use the lens of public wealth, you come to the exact opposite conclusion, which is to keep the mangrove where it is, because there's a problem if you do otherwise. This challenge is a thinking challenge. We just don't think about these things, and it's an attitude problem, as I think, just maybe some molecules wrong inside here. But the problem is a big problem. This is not just about shrimps or only about South Thailand. This is a global issue, ladies and gentlemen. The size of this was estimated by TrueCost for 3,000 of the top corporations. And their estimate was something like total externalities in terms of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, water extraction for free, where it should have a price, and costing the society, uses of natural resource, waste, heavy metals, pollution, etc. Total externalities, $2.1 trillion. That's like 3.5% of global GDP. That is big, and that can't go on. And sometimes these externalities can get internalized. For instance, in the case of BP, the Mexican Gulf of Mexico oil spill, sure. I mean, because there were costs and they've been estimated by various economists. Some of those costs were actually reflected in the $20 billion that BP had to take as a provision, and in the felony costs that it is paying up these days. And some of that were reflected in the market value loss of BP, $75 billion lost in the first month. And, of course, reputational damage and change of management. And there were costs that were internalized for BP. There was no question about that. But that's just one company, and that's one company in one situation. What about all of the others, the 3,000 companies, whose damage is not as obvious as an oil spill, but as subtle as just climate-changing emissions or water extraction or pollutants which are not controlled, et cetera, et cetera? We don't account for those, and that is part of the challenge. These externalities are actually a problem not just because they are creating harm, but because they are pushing us in the direction of the planetary boundaries that you mentioned earlier today, right? And the speed at which we are being pushed is also a problem. And people don't realize some of the push is happening in directions which are not everyday talking points, like phosphorus, for instance. 50% of phosphorus, it mainly comes, it's one of the key inputs to fertilizers. It mainly comes from rock phosphorus. 50% of rock phosphorus comes from Africa. 38% of the global supply of rock phosphorus from one country, Morocco. Is it a surprise that China is buying up land and mines in Morocco? Is this a risk? Potentially, because the sons of the soil argument will kick in at some point. There will be global shortages at some point, and there will be the usual political challenges that ensue. So this phosphorus could be the next oil kind of situation. We are not factoring that in. Overall, what we have is a whole slew of macro-level problems in terms of excessive demand, in terms of underpriced supply, in terms of depleting resources, whether it's water or phosphorus or biodiversity or whatever that is depleting. And finally, in terms of public capital, nature and society, which are being lost because of externalities not being accounted for. But each of those macro-level problems has a micro-level driver. In the case of excessive demand, is basically because we are creating it with advertising. We are creating consumerism. In fact, advertising, I see it as a sort of way of converting human insecurities into wants, wants into needs, needs into demand, demand into production. I mean, what you really need is mobility, but what you'll be convinced is you must buy, a Toyota Corolla or Toyota Prius, or even better, a Lexus, because somebody else has got a Prius, so you must have at least a Toyota Lexus, especially the fuel-efficient green type and so on. So you're just convinced by marketing and salesmanship that you need stuff which actually is just being planted in your head. You're being manipulated every hour of the day, every day of the week with this advertising, and that's part of the challenge. And the challenge is of excessive demand. We don't need a BlackBerry every 6 months or an iPhone every 6 months. We buy because somehow models change and we feel, sorry. BlackBerry, exactly. We feel that we need them, and they're chasing us all the time. So thankfully, this is an old BlackBerry, and I will not need to buy a new one unless this one collapses on me. But the challenge is also of underpriced supply. Yvon Chouinard, who's the Patagonia founder, said recently that, and he describes this very beautifully, an explanation of externalities, which is that everything manufactured is sold at a price cheaper than its cost. What he means, of course, is not that I'm making a loss. What he means is that I'm not reflecting the true cost of what I'm selling. And that's exactly true. And the reasons? Threefold. Leverage has risks. As I mentioned, it's an asymmetric equation where the gains out of expanding business fast using leverage belong to the corporation. If it gets too big, the costs belong to us because we are taxpayers. So you're not reflecting that. You're not reflecting the underpriced resources which are being used, and you're not reflecting externalities. That's the reason why. So once again, micro-level drivers for the macro-level problem. Resource depletion. We don't put in enough resource taxation in place. Therefore, we have excessive resource use. How can you have resource efficiency without resource taxation? We are taxing the goods and not the bads. We are taxing value addition by the corporation, the profits of the corporation. We are taxing hard work by people, as in labor, salaries. But we are not taxing any of the bads, including resource use, as in atmospheric use by carbon emissions and GHG emissions, or for that matter, resource extraction, all of the mining of scarce resources, be it phosphorus, be it gold, be it titanium, be it whatever. So this is the challenge here. And again, it's a question of how do you change the behavior of the corporation without changing the drivers? Externalization of costs, constant problem, the externalities I talked about. But the good news is that each of those micro drivers of the macro problem also has a micro solution, and that's sitting in front of us. And that's what I want to focus the next 10 minutes of this on, which is to talk about these solutions. Because yes, we can introduce ethics and accountability into advertising, and that will change the nature of consumerism. Yes, we can limit leverage. Yeah, it's been done by many countries and many companies as well. Yes, we can replace resource taxes and use them and use taxes instead of profits taxes. And yes, we can measure and disclose externalities. We can do all of this. So these are basically the recipes. And the reason I picked the 4 is not because they are the only 4 things that we need to change, but in my opinion, these are the 4 most urgent and important, both urgent and important. Because these are the key drivers, these are the solutions to those key 4 drivers that I talked about, which are then creating the big problems at the macro level that we have to worry about. Resource taxation, disclosing externalities, making advertising accountable, and limiting leverage for especially the too big to fail companies. And here are some of the examples of what can be done to limit leverage. And these are all existing, that these are solutions that have been used in terms of constraining, introducing capital adequacy ratios can be done. It's been done first with banks, then with finance companies, then with other financial institutions. We have expanded to whom capital adequacy applies, the people, the companies to whom it applies. We can expand it one step further to corporations of capitalization greater than $50 billion. It can be done. It's not the problem. We can look at consortium banking, which is a technique that used to be there in the UK, in Australia, in India, many places. Consortiums of bankers would get together and assess the company's need for finance, and then they would allocate that need across different banks as to how much you would lend. When consortium banking was battled against on the logic that this is not correct, it's a constraining system and it's blah and blah, but the fact is it contained risk. It enabled corporations to borrow, but from a known set of banks, and it forced them to borrow not a ridiculous amount of money, not an uncontrolled amount of money, but an amount of money that was with the knowledge of the entire consortium. So it's a way of containing the risk of leverage, and so on. And some companies are naturally risk averse, and they contain leverage. I actually asked Rob Walton this question. He's the chairman of Walmart, and I noticed that their leverage ratios, their gearing was actually quite low. So I asked him this question: how have you managed? Didn't you have times when you just had to borrow at ridiculous prices to maintain the growth of your business? And he says, yeah, I can't do the American accent, but my dad, Sam Walton, my dad took the company public because we were borrowing too much from the banks. So I said, really? How much were you borrowing from the banks? He says, $1,300,000. We both laughed, actually, because, this is so ridiculous that he takes Walmart public. This is a $450 billion corporation. Nowadays, if any borrower approaches a bank, you should actually look at this interview. It's kind of sweet. It's on the website, www.corp2020.com. Nowadays, if any borrower approaches a bank for a request less than a few $100 million, we think he's just, lazy balance sheet. What is he doing out there? Why is he a finance director, etc. But there are different ways of thinking of this. Advertising can be, now some people tell me that accountable advertising is an oxymoron, and maybe they're right. But I'd like to challenge that and say that there are ways of moving even this forward, because you need basically 2 principles. You need to recognize and treat all consumers equally. And that's not small. I'll give you one example of what that would do. To this day, even though the idea that mother's milk is better than, infant formula is better than mother's milk has been used to sell infant formula, baby milk powder, for a long time. And of course it was stopped because it's A, wrong, and B, harmful. And it's been stopped in all developing countries. But in some countries in Africa, it continues. You still see Bonnie babies advertised, mother's milk, this is better than mother's milk, blah. So it was actually 1930 where a lady doctor in Singapore first did the research on this and found that, in fact, this is wrong for 2 reasons. One is that poor mothers in Africa were diluting the infant formula because they were poor, and therefore you weren't getting enough nutrition. And secondly, the water that was being used for the infant formula was polluted, and therefore it was giving dysentery and diarrhea to the children, and that was actually the largest cause of infant deaths in Africa. So here's what was happening. Babies being killed as a result of this advertising strategy being applied across the world. And of course, this was heinous and it was stopped after a while, but the point is it continues. In 1930 to 2010, that's 80 years. 80 years is still carrying on. Why? Because you're treating a consumer in Africa differently from a consumer in Switzerland or in Australia or in the UK. That's not on. You just have to apply a simple principle. If this advertising isn't okay for the UK, then it's not okay for Nigeria either. It's very simple. Treat a human being as a human being, right? The second is about disclosure of policies. You have to have policies for advertising. What do you do and what don't you do? Disclose them. Just say what you do and don't do in advertising. Or is it that there are no holds barred? Because legally, there are indeed no holds barred. An advertisement is not an offer. It's not an acceptance. It's an invitation to treat. In law, it is just merely an inducement. You are not accountable for what you say in an advertisement is purely an opinion on your product. The fact that it leads you to buy my product, that's another story, right? So I can tell you, sir, that, you got to wear pink ties, they're great for health. So you go to the shop next door in which I own 50% shares and you buy 1 dozen pink ties, and a year later you come to me completely unhealthy, you had a heart attack, and you tell me, what is this crap, Pavan, you told me, buy pink ties. And I say, well, that's just my opinion, that was an ad. If you have a problem, go talk to the shop. You offered them money, they accepted it and gave you ties. Your problem's with the shop, not with me. I'm just the advertiser. That is actually legally correct. And you'll have to really argue hard to convince regulators to change rules to make me pay for the fact that I misled you about pink ties. That's how it is. So we have a system which is basically inherently a risk. And to address that risk, disclosure, absolutely essential. We need to do that. And then product level. At the product level, how often do we disclose the life of the product? As in, this iPhone can actually last 4 years if you let it, or this BlackBerry, or this car can drive for 10 years, but of course, we'll tell you to change it every year. How often do we advertise the fact that the longevity of the product matters? I think the only people I know who do that is the Swiss watchmakers, because they keep saying that this wristwatch is good for your son and your grandson and so on. And Patagonia, who tells you that don't buy this jacket because the last one, if it's 10 years old, is still okay. But not enough people do that. So disclosing the lifespan is a positive spin, that buy something because you can use it till it's old, selling the positive of being old as against the opposite. Disclosing countries of origin, recommending how to dispose of the product. These are simple things that can be done. And Jochen Seitz, who's the chairman of Puma, basically said this. I'm sorry, I can't play this because the technology has let me down, but you should log into the website and listen to this interview. He says, basically, consumerism was created by the corporation. It is our responsibility to convert that to a more responsible consumerism. That's really his statement. He wants his company and corporations generally to be not creators of collateral damage, but creators of collateral benefit, which basically means positive externalities. And he's done what he can. He has actually taken Puma forward and measured and disclosed their externalities, and showing, this is a table which shows what they are in value terms: water usage, greenhouse gases, land use as in deforestation, air pollution, waste management. And obviously it's important because he's a $250 million profits company, $250 million profits, and his externality is 145 million euros. That's about $200 million. Why would he not be concerned if his company is creating profits of $250 million and $200 million of costs to society at the same time? He should be concerned, and he is. He's trying to figure out what they are so that he can manage them down in future. And most of the managing down actually comes from the resource end. It is the cotton that is grown for their T-shirts, and the rubber that's grown for their shoe soles, and the leather uppers that are used and washed and create pollution. Those are the real costs. You can see that 75% is basically what they call tier 3 and 4, which is basically the supply of raw materials and the processing of raw materials. The factory itself doesn't contribute to much damage, but the rest of the value chain does. He counts, and as he should, from cradle to gate. That's the logic, that you're responsible for everything to the point of your sale. Up to that point, you're accountable. And the good news is that the externalities logic is moving forward. I think, Josh, you might have mentioned it in your session. But basically, a coalition has been created, which is literally a who's who of the people in this space. The Institute of, you can't see this very well. The Institute of Chartered Accountants of the UK, World Business Council, GRI, WWF, CI, CBD, UNEP, the World Bank, Accounting for Sustainability, IUCN, the International Integrated Reporting Committee. I mean, these are basically the professional bodies who are interested in this space of externalities. They are all represented in this coalition at the board level. So we have Peter Backer from the World Business Council who is on the board. These people were physically there in Singapore to help create this. That's their commitment. That shows their and their institutions' commitment. So I'm optimistic that this whole idea that we need to create standards and guidelines to assist corporations to measure their externalities, I think this can move forward, and it is moving forward. And lastly, I'll come to resource taxation with an example, which is US coal-fired electricity, which provides half of US electricity. It has externalities. Those costs are basically something like $300 billion of health costs and physical damage to property as a result of coal-fired electricity, which is actually more than the entire value added of that industry, which is about $230 billion. And the calculation is simple, that okay, let's take these externalities and say what would happen if you applied a tax, or sorry, one should never use the word tax in the US, I was told. So actually this slide, when I use it there, it says usage charges, resource usage charge. So resource usage charges of $30 billion can actually be paid back as tax refunds. By the way, you can say tax refund, but you can't say tax. Yeah, yeah. So those resource usage charges can actually be paid back to American people, and they can have tax refunds of $3,400 a piece in the middle income segment, as against a higher cost of just $200 direct costs in all cases, because there are indirect benefits and indirect costs as well. But that gives you a sense of the comparison of how elementary it is to get this right, and yet how politically challenging it is because of the opposition of the coal companies. And that is part of the challenge that I think has to be handled politically out here. It can work because we see it working. Norway has a resource tax of about 78% actually. If you add up the 50% of direct resource taxation, 28% of profits, that's 78% that on oil, Norwegian North Sea drilling in oil pays 78% of its value across to the government of Norway. I asked Erik Solheim, who's the minister in charge of environment and development, how on earth this works. Don't the corporations complain to you? He says, yes, they complain. They've been complaining for the last 25 years, but they still haven't left. So that's the story of resource taxation. I mean, if you want to get it right, you can. But, some countries where the story is different. This is our story. This is from Australia. I've just copied the line from the advertisement here. There was $22 million of advertisements a couple of years back. I was here at the time. I was speaking, among other things, on Teeb at the Sydney Opera House, and I was listening to these ads in the evening. I was wondering what's going on here. The ads were about strange concepts like, you're killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And here I am, foreigner, thinking, goose, mining company, geese? Like, what? Laid the golden egg? They lay gold in the soil? Australian mining companies must be really amazing. They lay coal and gold in the soil. I don't know. Maybe they're right. Maybe they are geese, actually. You've got to be a goose to think like that. Killing the goose that laid the golden egg, battle over golden goose, and from geese to swans. So here I was, foreigner tourist, and thinking, what kind of place is this? Where have I landed up? Anyway, so clearly that didn't work out. I mean, the thing with resource taxation is when it succeeds, it succeeds. Norway has generated $650 billion of money for its so-called GPFG, the Global Pension Fund. That money is used by them for infrastructure development, for supporting development in Norway and overseas. They spend a bit of money overseas. In Australia, we failed to raise $2 billion. I mean, that's crazy. If you have to fail raising money, at least fail raising $60 billion or something. Anyway, so if we get these things right, these 4 planks, I believe we'll see a new kind of corporation. We'll see a corporation whose goals are aligned with society. And they have to be, because you're creating collateral benefits, not collateral damage. You're a capital factory. You're not just creating financial capital for shareholders, but you're creating human capital for society. You're creating social capital in community. You are respecting and conserving natural capital for use of others. And this institute nature of the corporation and the community nature of the corporation is equally important, not just the natural capital side. And I'll give just one example of each. Infosys, and one of the IT majors in India, has this campus in a small city called Mysore in India. I've been there. It's an amazing campus. I don't have a picture right now of the main building, but it looks like Capitol Hill. It's as big as Capitol Hill. But on that one campus, they train 30,000 IT engineers every year. It's an intensive course. After the US of A and after the People's Republic of China, this is the 3rd largest generator of IT talent anywhere in the world. One campus, 300 acres. They do this because they believe in human capital. They believe in creating it, and they worry about losing it, and they do lose 15% of it every year because people leave. That's normal attrition. And you can calculate the externalities of that attrition because the learning gives them higher earnings. That earning power is going to someone else, competition, Australia, USA, wherever, right? So that is positive externality, which they've created for the rest of the world. That externality is $1.2 to $1.4 billion per year. Over the last 2 years, my company had done this calculation for them. And they've published it in their annual balance sheet. Positive externalities, collateral benefits. Yeah, it is possible. Equally, Natura, again, collateral benefits. This is a company in Brazil which sells all its products, basically cosmetics and personal products, using an army of 1.4 million housewives. They pay 33% commission to their, what they call consultants. They don't call them housewives, consultants. So these consultants get commission of 33%. That last year was $1.4 billion of commission across these housewives. Can you imagine what $1,000 extra per year does for a small family and for the woman in a small family in Brazil? It's a huge difference. It completely changes the power equation in the family. It changes, and this is statistically measured, the spending pattern of the family. So the family actually spends more on education and health if the woman is earning as against the man, where I presume they spend on drink and stuff. Sorry, apologies, guys. But basically, and not just that. So the woman is trained. She's using the skills in selling other product, another positive social capital externality. Because these women are basically not on anyone's headcount, no company's headcount. They're working out of their own free time, extra hours, etc. There's basically labor market efficiency because there's extra labor without accounting for it in the labor force. And so these are positive externalities created by Natura as a corporation. Even that, therefore, is possible. So I think there is enough to suggest that actually the genes, if you like, the genetic material of Corporation 2020 is sitting out there. It's showing, it's popping up, like a, what do you call it, a recessive gene. It pops up every now and again in places, and then it disappears because the main gene is still there. And that's the old gene of Corporation 1920. But you know what? Corporations are like species. If you want change in corporations, if you want evolution in a species, you change the environment. When the environment changes, species evolve. In the same way, the environment of the corporation is policies, prices, and institutions. And to me, that is the challenge. We have enough leaders, we have enough leadership, we don't have enough followership. If we total up all these people I'm talking about with good intentions and good examples, we are still left with only 5% of global GDP. What about the remaining 95%? To get from leadership to followership, to get to a green economy, we need to see change, and we need to see that change driven by rules and regulations changing. And that is basically about changing the environment of the corporation. You will get Corporation 2020. You need to make the changes. Those changes will have to come from a combination of these rulers and leaders. And that's what we want. Thank you.